Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome and thanks for joining us for another great Florida League of Cities webinar. I'm Kristen Jacobs of Kristen Jacobs Consulting, and I have the distinct pleasure to be your moderator for today's webinar entitled Increasing Resiliency Through Collaboration. We'll be joined today by three super smart women who have been working at the forefront of resiliency efforts here in the state of Florida: Karen Langbin, Margot Mooring, and Lynn Ingram. I'm going to be introducing each of them to you just before they make their presentations, so anyone who might be joining us late will know exactly which of our terrific speakers has the floor. But before I do that, I'd like to tell you about an exciting effort that's taking place here at the League, and that is President Matt Sorense's project called the Florida Regional Compact Initiative. At the heart of President Sorense's initiative is a conviction that cities are stronger when we solve problems together, we're stronger when we share our resources, and certainly we're stronger when we speak with one voice. The Florida Regional Compact Initiative is a voluntary program modeled after the nationally recognized Southeast Florida Climate Change Compact. FLC's newest initiative is designed to encourage cities to unite around a single shared challenge, which they choose together. The program will work to equip elected officials with the skills needed to collaborate across jurisdictional and ideological boundaries, as well as to craft and then commit to a joint action plan to address their region's unique needs. To that end, on October 8th, FLC will host a webinar that takes some of what you're going to learn today and help you take it to the next level. We'll be joined by three amazing panelists who have been in the trenches for the last 7 years and have played huge roles in the success of the Southeast Florida Climate Compact. They are Dr. Jennifer Jurado, who is Director of Environmental Planning and Community Resilience for Broward County, Susie Torriente, who just left the city of Fort Lauderdale as Assistant City Manager to join in a similar capacity over in the city of Miami Beach, and Steve Adams of the Institute for Sustainable Communities, who is helping communities all across the United States create their own compacts and has been a big part of the success for the Southeast Florida region. I hope that you will go online and sign up for that webinar on October 8th, and that you will join us in helping President Sorense's initiative be successful. So, okay, let's get started. Today's webinar, Increasing Resiliency Through Collaborations. This session will last about 45 minutes with 15 minutes for questions during and at the end of the presentation. So you can write out your questions and submit them, and then we'll take them at the end of each presentation. Please use the question and answer section to submit your questions, or you can submit them to your webinar speaker via their contact information at a later time. Don't worry if the presenter isn't able to get to your questions during the webinar. We'll make sure to review all the unanswered questions at the end and deliver a response after the webinar session has concluded. The recorded version of the webinar will be posted in the FLC website at www.floridaleagueofcities.com under the Events and Training tab following the session. All right, our first presenter today is Karen Langbin. Karen is a PhD student in rhetoric at the University of South Florida and is currently finishing her dissertation, Science, Policy, and Decision-Making, a case study of deliberative rhetoric and policy making for coastal adaptation in Southeast Florida. That is a mouthful. And Karen is going to talk to us about this project. It's based on her involvement with the social sciences team of the National Science Foundation grant through the College of Marine Science. Karen's research is focused on identifying regional barriers to adaptation, suggesting strategies for reframing adaptation, and providing insight into the process of stakeholder engagement. She's also a program assistant with the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council, participating in the Climate Science Advisory Panel on the One Bay Initiative, which is a NOAA Coastal Resiliency Networks grant. So thank you, Karen. We're so happy to have you today, and I'll give the floor over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I apologize for that long dissertation title. The title of this presentation is much shorter. Today I'll be focusing on Tampa Bay's collaborative effort to engage regional stakeholders in sea level rise planning and policy in our region. The Regional Planning Council has traditionally focused on coastal resilience in terms of shorter-term, one-time events like hurricanes and storms. In 1981, the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council developed the first regional hurricane evacuation strategy in the U.S., It's a study that is still used today as a template for hurricane preparedness around the U.S. In 2011, starting with a knowledge exchange with Dutch water management experts called Resilient Tampa Bay, the Regional Planning Council expanded its scope to include the longer-term efforts of coastal vulnerability as well. Next slide. To initiate the process of developing this vision, we hosted a reality check workshop in 2007, which is pictured here, where we asked for input from local elected officials, business leaders, policymakers, and interested citizens about how to envision future development and land planning through the next 150 years. Through phone surveys and town halls, internet surveys, and an entire suite of outreach efforts, we reached approximately 10,000 stakeholders to involve in this process. Next slide. We have been working on coastal resilience for a long time and have recently come to realize that this means more than hurricane preparedness. Given our expertise in emergency planning and the degree of support that has been developed in this region for this vision, we applied for a NOAA CREST grant, which is Coastal Resilience Networks grant, in which we proposed to repurpose the One Bay Livable Communities group by expanding its membership and participation to emergency management, floodplain managers, and those who could help to develop a holistic, longer-term vision for responding to coastal vulnerabilities. The mission statement for the new One Bay Resilient Communities Working Group is to develop practical strategies for the Tampa Bay region to withstand the effects of sea level rise and other climate hazards. Most importantly, our focus is on pragmatic applications of scientific data for regional policymaking. Next slide. The primary deliverable of the CREST grant is to build a network where we begin moving from dialogue about vulnerabilities to specific adaptive actions for our region. As a convener of the region, it is a good fit for us to be engaging our local members and sharing these practices about coastal resilience and sea level rise. Our focus is on pragmatic and operational strategies for our specific region because of the realization that adaptation looks different in different locations because of factors like geology, socioeconomic values and preferences, etc. Next slide. Part of building a common language and knowledge base is making sure that our individual communities have answers to some of these basic questions about sea level rise. So how does sea level rise in Tampa Bay today compared to sea level in the 1940s? A major part of moving from dialogue to action was ensuring that our conception of the problem was consistent. As translators of scientific information for the region, this was a necessary first step. So what has the trend in sea level change been? Next slide. So where we start is data that's measured in our stakeholders' backyards, a place that they're familiar with, which is pictured here, the Coast Guard base at in St. Petersburg, Florida. Also on the slide is a graph which shows a historical rise in sea level, which you can trace along the red line. At our local St. Petersburg tide gauge, the sea level is 6.6 inches higher today than it was in 1946. And again, this isn't global data. This is local data, and what we're experiencing here in Tampa Bay. Next slide. We also want our stakeholders to know that Tampa Bay is experiencing sea level rise in its own way. For example, when you see a story in the news media about the level of rise in the mid-Atlantic states or in Houston, Texas, we want our stakeholders to know that our circumstances are different. Next slide. Every coastal region will have a different degree of threat. Per a study commissioned by the World Bank, Tampa may be less vulnerable than some regions, for example, the Louisiana coast, but more vulnerable than others, like certain places in the Northwest. Tampa, however, was reported to be the 7th most vulnerable metro area in the U.S. In terms of what to expect, acknowledging the time horizon is extremely important. A recently published NOAA study on tipping points, which are the point at which nuisance flooding occurs more than 30 times a year, suggests that we have about 30 years to develop a viable long-term plan for larger scale adaptation before experiencing the effects of longer-term sea level change. Next slide. So on an even smaller scale, we're also concerned with how sea level rise affects individual communities, as communities within coastal regions have different degrees and types of impacts. What types of specific scenarios should communities prepare for, and how will sea level rise affect your community? There are a variety of tools that allow you to visualize plausible futures regarding how sea level rise will affect these individual communities. Next slide. This example is an image generated by the NOAA Sea Level Rise Viewer, which is a tool that projects potential expected inundation. Here it's at about 3 feet. A lot of times citizens are concerned about the properties on the Gulf of Mexico side here, but this map shows that perhaps some of the impacts would be greater in the intracoastal areas. Green on the map represents low-lying areas. Next slide. Most importantly, we want our communities to understand that it's not too late. The problem is not insurmountable, and the decisions we make today can protect the vision we articulated through the One Bay process. Next slide. One of the goals of our One Bay Resilient Communities project is to provide a clearinghouse of resources, tools, and reports on sea level rise projections, adaptation efforts in other coastal regions, scientific data on the Tampa Bay region's existing vulnerabilities, and tools for visioning and long-term planning for economic, environmental, and social impacts. This is what we've put together in our onebay.org site. Next slide. Another part of our project is promoting a sea level rise projection, which is recommended by the Climate Science Advisory Panel of the One Bay Working Group. The panel is convened by Florida Sea Grant and includes participation from academic researchers and scientists from regional and federal agencies who are working together to make regional scientific data usable for long-term resilience planning. Collaboration between One Bay and the Climate Science Advisory Panel provides decision support that is informed by science and policy context. So the science is appropriately applied in policymaking, and the research agenda is informed by policy needs. Next slide. The key findings of the recommendation from the Climate Science Advisory Panel are that projections of sea level rise should be regionally corrected using the St. Petersburg tide gauge, our local tide gauge. Sea level rise projections should be consistent with the National Climate Assessment, or NOAA, estimates and methods. And adaptation planning should employ a scenario-based approach that considers location, time horizon, and risk tolerance. The impacts experienced in individual communities will be different, and so will residents' risk tolerance. Therefore, we aren't suggesting that one number provides a silver bullet for sea level rise planning. Instead, we're giving a range of plausible options and will then help communities to examine their individual contexts in order to determine which level in the projection is the best fit for them. Next slide. This is an example of what the numbers look like in our recommendation from the Climate Science Advisory Panel. We're looking at up to nearly 7 feet of rise by 2100 at the NOAA high estimate. Next slide. Finally, we want to spend the next year or so of our grant making sure that our local government partners can understand how to apply this recommendation in a meaningful way. We want them to understand these decision contexts and think in terms of scenarios and determining which scenario is most appropriate for a particular project. One example of the type of work that we've done and looking to do more of is a pilot assessment in Hillsborough County of how critical transportation infrastructure may be affected by storm surge and sea level rise, and what that effect has on the regional economy. For example, if we were to lose a bridge from storm surge or a flooding event, at what point does the cost of adaptation make sense given the loss of that bridge or roadway's negative impact to the regional economy? Does the benefit to the regional economy exceed the cost of improvement? Our strategy for collaboration about long-term coastal vulnerability has been to involve a variety of regional partners and experts, emphasize the importance of consistency in our terminology and messaging, and to develop actionable, pragmatic solutions that address our region's specific risks. Thank you. Next slide. Are we taking questions now, or are we waiting until the end of all of the presentations?
We don't have any questions at this time.
Okay.
Kristen, we're unable to hear you.
Well, this is Margot. Maybe I'll just go ahead and get started.
Thank you. That'll be great.
Okay.
Here, Margot, you know what? I had the wrong button up. Forgive me. I thought it was unmuted. Do you mind just stepping back a second? Let me go ahead and introduce you.
Sure.
Okay, so Margot, as you all just heard, is our next presenter. Margot Mooring is an amazing person, has managed to get herself all over the Northeast and actually South and other areas of our state. She's the Director of Policy for the Northeast Florida Regional Council and also is the Executive Director for the Regional Community Institute for Northeast Florida. Margot joined the Regional Council staff as Director of Policy in January of 2008. She led efforts to establish a 50-year vision for growth and development in the First Coast, completed an update to the regional plan informed by the vision, and then staffed the Regional Community Institute, the acronym is RCI, policy recommendations on sea level rise in Northeast Florida, an action item identified by the vision. She now works with a business-focused committee of the Council on actions related to resiliency. Prior to joining the RCI, she was the Chief of Strategic Planning at the City of Jacksonville Planning and Development Department. And then before moving to Florida in 2000, she was Executive Director of Strategic Planning with the New York City Department of Citywide Administrative Services in the Division of Real Estate. Margot graduated from Jacksonville University and has a Master of Philosophy degree in Town Planning from University College in London. She is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners and the Royal Town Boy, that's tongue-tied. The Royal Town Planning Institute. Margot, welcome.
Thank you, Kristen. Okay, if we could go to the next slide, I'll show you where Northeast Florida is. We're that kind of aquamarine color in the upper right-hand corner adjacent to Georgia. I'm sure you're familiar with us, but that's the 7-county area that I'm going to be talking about. Next slide. Okay, I thought it might be helpful to make some observations about Northeast Florida because I thought some of them might apply to your region as well. We don't talk about climate change much, and we're not very interested in government, especially federal or state governments. We are not interested in taxes or spending very much. And we specifically, as our regional council, we didn't have any funding for this effort. This is not something that we had gotten a grant for or had specific funding for. Um, we we as a region don't particularly like being told what to do, which sounds like a bit of an outlier, but it's actually a place where energy comes from in our experience. So that's why I included it. And of course, we have smart, dedicated citizens, and we have a strong network of businesses and civic groups. So those are the things we kind of have to work with. So I kind of put them into categories. If we could go to the next slide, I'll tell you how. So your citizens don't like being told what to do, and they're smart and they're dedicated, and they have strong networks of business and civic groups. That leads me to conclude that they should do the leadership, not planners. That's been a consistent approach that we've taken since we did the vision that Kristen described, and for us it's been working. Next slide. Okay, so we're not talking about climate change much, and we're not so interested in government, especially federal or state government. So for us, that leads us to leading with business. Here, if business thinks something is important, thinks it's worth talking about, then government can talk about it. It just seems to work that way. Another thing that we noticed is looking at what is already being done gets you to a place where you're not starting. So it may be hard to start a conversation about climate change, but your regions are all doing stuff already about alternative fuels or about energy efficiency or green building. You're doing something. So if you look at it that way, you're not starting. So that's easier. It puts you in a different place. And then you call it whatever works. Resiliency is the word that we've been using. It's been working for us. Next slide. And then we don't like taxes, and we don't particularly like to spend money, and we have no specific funding. And for us, keeping it to doable actions, thinking about this as we decide what to do, figuring out with what partnerships, what can we do, even given those limitations, and then only recommending the things that we can do was very important. So that's how I would approach those things that I think some of which you might have in common with us. Next slide. So we started with the regional council has a nonprofit that it works with, sort of like a think tank called the Regional Community Institute. They're specific to policy work, and they come from, we have a regional leadership academy that people get nominated for. They're leaders from all different sectors, not necessarily, there's some government, lots of private sector, lots of nonprofit, but basically people who are interested in the region and in policy. And it also includes our members of the Regional Council Board. They were given the task of creating a vision for growth and development in the region for the next 50 years. They call that First Coast Vision. And one of its action items was, as you see there, bring together leadership and experts from the region to determine climate change impact and, if indicated, mitigation and an adaptation plan. So they didn't cover it in the vision. They simply identified it as something that needed to be covered. The Regional Council then spent about 6 months asking for what was important in the area of climate change, and what came in overridingly was sea level rise. Next slide. So the nonprofit created a committee that was, they assigned to their emergency preparedness committee the policy work on sea level rise. And this is basically what they asked them to do. Determine if we're vulnerable. If so, what assumptions should we use for level of rise and time frame? They were asked to do community resiliency assessments with interested coastal and waterfront communities. And that was, those were voluntary, but it was a way to get the conversation started. And to use what was learned to provide policy recommendations to the Regional Council Board, which they did in October 2013. The board approved them without any changes in November 2013. And if you're interested in looking at our regional action plan, just go to our homepage, and then we have a tab for resources, and you'll find it there. Next slide, please. So they decided in very short order that we are vulnerable, and also in very short order, they figured out what assumptions they wanted to use. They got a presentation from the U.S. Army Corps about the potential for acceleration of level of rise. They looked at the same tidal gauges that were discussed in the last presentation. And they came to the conclusion that we should use 1 to 3 feet by 2060 and 3 to 6 feet by 2110. Had they just listened to the Army Corps, they probably would have assumed 1 to 2 feet by 2060. But there was work being done by the Guantanamo Matanzas National Estuarine Research Reserve to look at Matanzas Basin at the same time, and they were finding that 3 feet was where impacts are really felt in that much more robust study than what we were doing. So rather than have there be inconsistency in message, and with the understanding that we're just beginning and we had to start somewhere and we needed to keep an eye on the science, we decided to use 1 to 3 by 2060, 3 to 6 by 2110. And that was using just the simplest NOAA bathtub coverage and just to get the conversation started. And the next slide will show you what it kind of looks like for our region. So next slide. As you can see, you can't really do much planning based on this, but you can certainly get the conversation started. We have maps like this for all of the resources that are included in our strategic regional policy plan. This is the economic development map that shows the largest employers. Naval bases tend to be very important employers, and they are certainly impacted in Northeast Florida. So it just kind of sends that message. Next slide. So the results of their work are a regional action plan on sea level rise. And these are basically kind of the categories of recommendations that they made. One was to make it easy to find data that was related to risk and vulnerability. The second was about kind of education, engaging the community. The third was about saving money, and there's 2 areas. One is using the community rating system more robustly, and the other was infrastructure, cost, and benefit, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. I won't go into it now. And that idea of collaboration and leveraging success, taking advantage of doing more of what's been working. And then the one I'll talk a little bit more about is engaging the business sector in long-term resiliency. Next slide. So that's what we call P2R2, which stands for Public-Private Regional Resiliency. So it was recommended in the plan that there be a committee of the regional council that was called that, Public-Private Regional Resiliency. With a goal of, and it was a very specific goal, develop a regional strategy that will incentivize population and private development to locate outside of vulnerable areas, just that. And it was to be comprised of business and community leaders that were not necessarily advocates for climate change coming in, but simply were leaders that people would follow and were interested enough to volunteer for this kind of work. And as I said, there were no specific funding, and folks had to be persuaded to join because they were volunteers. Next slide. So these were the metrics that the Regional Action Plan said that we should include, and they all have to do with the impact of a major storm event or sea level rise on private investment. It's all about private investment. So this is the metrics that we would call the baseline metrics for P2R2. Next slide. So these are really the highlights of the work of P2R2. That first bullet point is kind of their mantra. The world is changing. We work to position Northeast Florida to thrive in that change. They adopted, as the nonprofit has done in the regional action plans that they've done, the idea that they should be recommending doable actions only. So they thought it through. How would you get it done, with what partners, who'll fund it, how do you do it? And if it met all those tests, then it got in there. They used the same assumptions that the Emergency Preparedness Committee had used for the region, just to get themselves started. They decided to align their recommendations with 100 resilient cities because Jacksonville had been selected as one of the 100 resilient cities. They thought there's probably leverage there to make the good stuff coming out of that regional and to also further that for Jacksonville. So they looked at what is already being done as a baseline, because their position was that they weren't starting anything, they were simply doing more of good things. And they decided among themselves, not at our sort of encouragement, they decided that they weren't just looking at sea level rise, they were looking at changing climate. They agreed. The committee is 14 members, including banks and risk assessors, and it's a pretty diverse group. They agreed on language for an op-ed that appeared in our paper, our largest paper, which is the Florida Times-Union, in May of this year. And then they launched their action at one of the coolest public meetings I've ever been to, because it was at our local Museum of Contemporary Art, and it was sponsored by Regions Bank, and we're very grateful. And they had like wine and cheese and art, so it was wonderful. And it did kind of send the message that the business community came, and the business community cares about this issue. They have a pretty robust website they just go to the icon on our homepage at nefrc.org, and you'll find sort of more than you want to know about P2R2. Next slide. I did want to include a slide to let you know that because we used volunteers, we tried to keep in mind that we had to keep it fun. Now, whether that means we didn't go into enough depth on some things, I mean, I suppose that's a possibility. On the other hand, you'll lose people if they're not having a good time. So we fed them. I'd make breakfast for the P2R2 committee, but also we tried to, kind of do reasonable bites of things to do that were interesting. And with that kind of philosophy, we've been successful at keeping people engaged and getting more people engaged. So the action teams are going to be meeting on the action items I'm about to talk to you about up until June. They start next Monday and they meet up until June. We expect them to be well advanced or done with most of the action items that P2R2 came up with, and P2R2 is simply monitoring progress during this period. So let's talk about their action. Next slide. So I'm not going to take you through in a lot of detail, but you'll notice that these are organized by what 100 Resilient Cities calls their dimensions of resiliency of cities, because they wanted to keep that match going. So the first one is to sort of look at vulnerable populations and make sure that we think through a major event and whether or not we're ready. So that's a readiness one. They've convened a committee of folks who are looking towards building resiliently in Northeast Florida. So in their judgment, the sort of standard images that you get associated with CRS or from FEMA are not good enough to really reflect how you would do it in Northeast Florida. And also in their judgment, if you went into the buildings departments in our area, you wouldn't find necessarily that the counter personnel know as much about resiliency options as, say, they know about how to replace your roof. So they wanted to make sure that there was a kind of common understanding about what you can do, how to do it here, who does it, how much it costs, that kind of practical building resiliency. They're going to do a design competition, and you'll hear some more about that, but they're going to do that kind of on a shoestring, but they're going to do a version of a design competition mostly targeted towards the arts, cultural, community, and education, and young people. Next slide. Okay, their vulnerable areas action item is simply keeping up with the best data. Their less vulnerable areas action item is a very interesting one in that we have very good data that was done by the North Florida Land Trust to look at ecosystem service values of properties in light of sea level rise. And so a lot of the data already exists to look at, okay, if these properties are vulnerable, what properties would we consider less vulnerable? Like, where should we be developing? And so this policy discussion is going to be held in a kind of public forum, and we'll have a very interesting conversation. We're calling the the last Monday of the month, we're having meetings for these kinds of action items. And so it's open to the public to have a discussion about this. We call it Regional Resiliency Evening Exchanges. So less vulnerable areas is, I'm pretty sure, going to be a well-attended meeting. Infrastructure checklist and adaptation cost benefit, that is simply taking the work that NOAA had done under what will adaptation cost, that economic framework, and making it usable in Northeast Florida, so developing the assumptions for that, and then using an infrastructure checklist and the model they've been using in San Francisco, but basically taking that good, those good tools out there and making them specific to Northeast Florida. Next slide. They're doing a super easy business risk survey. The idea is to get businesses that haven't been involved in business continuity kinds of planning before, to get them just interested enough to go to the tons of resources that are already available. So they have various strategies for kind of driving people to do that kind of very entry-level survey. I mentioned Regions Bank before. Regions Bank in our area has added financial to their financial literacy, the literacy training that they do, the idea that resiliency is something that you should be thinking about. And so we'll be expanding that beyond Regions Bank to the other financial literacy programs that banks have. Our group was interested in, you'll remember, this was specifically the charge of P2R2. And they were interested in two approaches. One is they thought there might be a way to use tax increment financing as a way to incentive development in those less vulnerable areas, which another action item will determine. And more recently, they've been interested in PACE, but they will be getting together smart people in a room to talk about how to use those two, at a minimum, techniques so that a local government that's considering action isn't beginning at square one. They're beginning with some observations made by local smart people who know about the issues and have thought them through before they decide what to do. Next slide. Leadership training is an interesting one because they felt sort of strongly that if the business community sponsored or supported local elected officials to get trained on climate communication and adaptation and what to do, when they came back and shared that message, it would be well received. Absent the business community, it will not be so well received. So they want to be involved in that. They want to be involved in metrics because the metrics that they have are just the ones that you saw, and that's not, perhaps anything that addresses, for example, mitigation. And then the final one, they decided that they needed a vulnerability assessment. You'll see it's in a different kind of type because this is the one that's not necessarily doable because it's going to cost money and we don't have money. But they called it We Can Dream Vulnerability Assessment because they do acknowledge that you can't really expect a local government or a private landowner to make adaptation decisions based simply on the NOAA bathtub data. That's probably not enough. So that is the one action item that they realize we need to do and that is not funded. So next slide. That is an overview of what we're doing here in Northeast Florida. We are kicking off the action items, the actual doing of the action items next Monday, and we'll be doing them, as I said, until June. And feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to help anybody who thinks that some of these ideas might be useful to them. Thanks.
Thank you, Margot. That was just terrific. Erica, do we have any questions for her?
No questions at this time, Kristen.
Okay, great, thanks. Let's move on to our last speaker is Lynn Ingram. Lynn is Rebuild by Design's policy manager. Her work focuses on working with cities and communities on resiliency and addressing the issues of social and physical vulnerability. She also focuses on identifying and addressing policy barriers to resiliency implementation and working to promote governance structures and regional coordination which allow communities to better prepare for a changing climate. Previously, Lynn worked at the World Wildlife Fund, focusing on climate change, renewable energy, resiliency, and cities. Lynn's commentary has appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle, Huffington Post, Climate Progress, and Sustainable Cities Collective, among others. She started her climate career at the Environmental Policy from American University and her BS in Public Affairs and Environmental Management from Indiana University. Please join me in welcoming Lynn.
Thank you for that introduction. So, a big part of the webinar is around collaboration, local government, and, around resiliency and climate change. And I think the Rebuild by Design example, the competition that happened in the Northeast after Sandy, is a really good example of what collaboration at a large scale can look like. As many of you guys are aware, Hurricane Sandy was unlike any other storm that the Northeast had ever experienced. It was unprecedented in its damages, and it revealed the true threat that the effects of climate change posed to communities, states in the region. A huge number of states were impacted. The entire mid-Atlantic of the Northeast was impacted. It led to emergency and major disaster declarations made in 13 states. Go ahead, next slide. Next slide. And it was the second costliest storm in U.S. history, and so the damages were pretty severe. It was also led to enormous amount of damage, and everybody really felt the impact of Hurricane Sandy, whether it was your home was destroyed, or you lost power, or it disrupted your commute, or maybe your business was closed for a few days, or maybe it never opened up again. And so it really brought the region to its knees in ways that had never happened before. And while hurricanes, I think, they're much more common in Florida, and these type of scenes are much more common in Florida for the region, the Sandy region. They'd never seen anything like it, and it was also kind of a wake-up call to this was going to be happening more frequently. And so it was definitely a process of, well, how do you build back, but also how can we think about building back stronger, better, and more innovatively. And from that, next slide, came the Rebuild by Design competition. So President Obama had a Hurricane Sandy task, a lot of recommendations, and one of them, of the many, was holding a design competition, essentially, to get the best and the brightest minds in the world to come together and think about how do you respond to Hurricane Sandy. How can we create a process for communities and government to work with designers for a shared vision of a more resilient region? And so Rebuild by Design was essentially a design competition, trying to think about how do you make this region prepare for the next storm in an innovative and better way. And so next slide. When you think of design competitions, I don't know how many people are familiar with them, or just like competitions in general, oftentimes it's about issuing like an RFP and saying, here's the problem, come back and bring us your solutions. And this approach was very different. It wasn't going to be, we know the problem and we're asking you for the solution. It was about, we're not sure what the problem is. And there's a lot of things in the region that are going on. There's a lot of interdisciplinary aspects. We want to figure that out, and we want you to come help us figure that out. And so it was about getting the best minds in the room in a very kind of interdisciplinary approach. It was about making it collaborative and comprehensive and inclusive for everybody that was involved, that was impacted, and thinking about how can we create solutions that are replicable, but they're also regional and not just narrow in scope, and that can be implementable in the end, because that's ultimately what the goal was, to have implementable solutions. So next slide. And so the idea was to get a group of people in the room, groups of designers, to think about the physical and the social vulnerability. With this, everybody thinks about, when they think about disasters, they're always thinking about building back, and which is really important, but there's this other aspect of social vulnerability. Next slide. That's really about what are the needs of the communities, and what are the communities facing, and are there ways that we can think about addressing those while we address the physical vulnerabilities as well. Next slide. So this was very much a collaborative effort. It was a competition that was funded primarily by the Rockefeller Foundation and run by a set of 4 partners, which essentially they brought kind of different disciplines to the competition. IPK, also part of NYU, brought the academic aspect. The Regional Plan Association, they brought this idea of, they're the only organization that looks at the entire region as a whole in terms of city function and planning, kind of crossing municipal boundaries, and so they kind of brought that perspective. The Van Allen Institute does design competitions, so they were part of it from that perspective, and then the Municipal Art Society are the group that was really plugged in with the communities and being on the ground. And of course, you had the philanthropy with these partners, and then the government, state and local government were also part of the process, with HUD being the federal component, and they were the drivers in terms of providing the funding for the projects, and were a big part of it with the CDGB money. Next slide. So I wanted to kind of give you an idea of what the competition was and how was it collaborative in its approach. So this is a bit of a kind of a timeline. So the beginning part was about asking the best minds to come together, and so it was a call for talent. Like I said before, it wasn't about having asking folks to come together and come up with a solution. Is about just come and tell us who's on your team and how you will approach a problem. And so 148 teams applied, 10 were selected, and these teams were composed of not just your typical like engineers and architects and city planners, but they were composed of hydrologists, policy folks, community organizers, and so a large landscape of folks were part of these design teams, because it wanted to be very interdisciplinary in its approach. And those teams were selected and led through a collaborative research phase, which is kind of like a fact-finding phase, determining what is the problem of the region, what are the physical and social vulnerabilities. And then the collaborative design phase is around working with communities and government to design a solution that will ultimately lead to an implementable solution. Next phase. Next slide. And so the research phase was a 3-month process, and it was about visiting. It was really about seeing the region as a whole and talking to communities and seeing what happened after Sandy, doing site tours, talking with communities and neighborhoods, and also doing a fair amount of data analysis. Next slide. And we visited places all along the coastline that were impacted heavily by the hurricane. We explored themes that were, from all the way from public transit to environmental justice issues to vulnerable populations to public housing and economic development. Next slide. And then also examining what actually happened in the region. What were the impacts? Why did the power go out? Why were certain areas contaminated? What were what actually happened in the region? Next slide. And then looking at the risks and interdependencies. So there was a lot of components of, you have the power supply obviously went out. Where are the areas that have vulnerable power supplies that are in the 100-year floodplain? Where's the fuel storage in the region? Are they in areas that are very vulnerable to climate change? And taking a look at all of those things and thinking about the location and the interdependencies. Next slide. And then mapping that and looking at the existing vulnerabilities as a whole. So it's the physical for sure, but it's also the social and it's the economic vulnerabilities as well, and laying them on top of each other. And when the design teams did that, a lot of areas kind of bubbled up as particular areas of vulnerability. Also, as we would call them, areas of opportunity. That there was a great need, but there was also the potential for finding solutions that could deal with a lot of different issues. So next slide. So the teams then came together, and they after the research phase came up with 41 design opportunities. So each team had about 3 to 5 areas that they thought would be great areas to work in and to come up with a solution. And so ultimately each team ended up having one project that they would work on. And then from that, next slide, they went into the collaborative design phase, which was taking all the research that they had come up with, all of the collaboration with the communities and with government agencies, taking all that information, and looking at one particular design opportunity, one particular area that they were going to focus on. Next slide. And they came together with that as an actual kind of physical, or I guess it could be a plan too. It didn't always have to be a physical solution, but designing a solution and taking that solution, designing it, and then going back into the community that they had, to the communities that they had already gone to and talked to about their vulnerabilities, and showing what they had come up with. And then in that, that interaction happened in lots of ways, whether it was through stakeholder engagement, whether it was through more tours, and there's also creative ways that they did events to get people out to really take a look at these proposals to get their input, because ultimately they wanted to get input from the community and make sure the community was on board. Next slide. And this led to a wide broad range of collaboration and networking development. Hundreds of neighborhoods were involved, and a large amount of community organizations and government agencies and philanthropy and partners were all part of this process that ultimately ended up producing these kind of 10 solutions that were meant to be replicable and regional in scale. Next slide. So 10 solutions were presented to HUD and the partners in terms of picking which ones would go forward, but they ranged in breadth and scope in terms of some of them were very focused on using nature-based solutions, having oyster beds, or using wetlands for wave attenuation and flooding. Other ones were, I think the one that's probably the most well-known is called the Big U, which is about building a living berm all the way around the lower tip of Manhattan, which is kind of interesting. Is instead of building a seawall, let's build something that the communities can be connected to for 99% of the time when there is no storm, and then but also protect when there is that storm, that that 1% of the time. And then other solutions were, I think one of the kind of interesting ones that I think did the best job of marrying social and physical vulnerability was the Hunts Point solution, which was a place where, in terms of physical vulnerability, it's New York City's food hub, and so that area obviously had lots of reasons why it needed to be protected, but it's also the lowest, one of the poorest congressional districts in the country, has one of the highest asthma rates. So there's also all these other social issues that they wanted to address as part of this process. Next slide. And so of these 10 projects that were proposed, 6 of them were ultimately selected, and the CDBG money from HUD ultimately was doled out to individual teams to help with the implementing process. Next slide. And as I talked a little bit about earlier, this approach has multiple components of it that were, I think, very innovative and how it went about doing it, but also looking at you can take aspects of what happened in the Sandy region and think about how they can be utilized in other places in the country. So I think that there are a lot of lessons learned that came out of the process. One of the biggest ones was the public engagement process and having them involved. They were involved from the very beginning, and that process itself, having them in the very beginning stages of the research and then having the collaborative design, has led to a very robust support system now that the public has when they're going back and looking at implementing these projects. And so we're now a year out from these projects, and these projects have kind of unprecedented support among the public because they felt they were part of the process of creating these projects, and that it wasn't just designers going behind closed doors, having a project, coming back to the public and be like, here we have a solution. So it felt very integrated with the public. These solutions, they utilized innovation technology to really solve these problems that hadn't really been done before in such kind of a collaborative but also kind of wide-ranging way. A lot of people really felt that these solutions wouldn't have happened if it was just government on its own producing it. It was about a combination of having philanthropy, nonprofits, communities, and government all come together, and obviously the private sector with the design teams come together and think about this. And all of those groups have their have their strengths and their weaknesses and kind of coming together to create the best projects possible. And then, the process itself led to a better understanding of the region and the diversity of needs in the region. So the communities had a better understanding of what was happening in terms of what kind of impacts might happen in the future, what are the things that they want to see happen, and then the design teams being a part of that process, that plugged into having a much better understanding of what the solutions would be. So next slide. As I mentioned before, the approach itself, while it was specific to the Sandy region, it had a lot of components that you could take and have it in different parts of the country. And the independent evaluations that were done on the process and the competition itself was, had really said it had a lot of potential for transforming how we think about disaster recovery, and even how we might even think about pre-disaster and thinking about how do we want to approach resiliency. It got a lot of accolades in terms of naming. It was named one of the best ideas I've seen in 2013. So there are a lot of aspects of it, I think, that are replicable in different places, and that had a really kind of strong components that could be utilized other places. And that, I think I'm out of my time, but I think I'm done with my slides. So I guess we'd open it up for questions for my presentation, everybody's presentation.
Erica, do we have questions for Lynn?
No, we don't have any questions.
We don't. Okay. Well, it's interesting watching all of the slides and our awesome speakers, and you truly see that resiliency takes many forms, and we hope that those of you who were able to join today's webinar, if you are interested in additional information, you can go to Florida League of Cities and access their webpage and download any of the information that was shared today. I want to thank everyone for participating in the webinar, Increasing Regional Resiliency Through Collaborations, hosted by the Florida League of Cities, and especially wanted to take a moment to thank our presenters, Karen Langbin, Margot Mooring, and Lynn Ingham, for your insightful and informative presentations. At this time, the webinar has concluded, but don't forget, you can review the recorded version that's posted on the FLC website. Thank you, everybody.